Lee Rigby, also known as Fusilier Lee Rigby, was a British soldier who tragically lost his life in a brutal attack in Woolwich, London on May 22, 2013. Lee Rigby was stationed at an army barracks in Woolwich, London. He had joined the British Army in 2006 and served in the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, hence the title before his name. His murder horrified onlookers and shocked the nation because of its savage brutality. On May 22, 2013, Lee Rigby was making his way back to his barracks in Woolwich, southeast London. Rigby took the London Underground before walking close to the barracks. As he crossed a busy street, a car deliberately plowed into him. He was sent flying into the ground and was probably in a state of shock, when two men hopped out of the car and proceeded to stab and hack at Lee Rigby with knives. He didn't see it coming and he never stood a chance. The attackers, Michael Adebolojo and Michael Adebowale, were both armed with knives and a cleaver. Some reports state that Adebolojo even had a revolver. Everything had taken place in broad daylight. Therefore, the attack was witnessed by many people, some of whom captured the horrifying incident on their phones. One bystander was brave enough to confront one of the attackers, asking why he had just done what he'd done. The attacker argued that the reason was because the British Army was killing civilians in Muslim countries.
I apologize that women had to witness this today, but in our land, our women have to see the same. You people will never be safe. Remove your governments, they don't care about you. Tell them to bring our troops back so you can all live in peace. Leave our lands and you will live in peace, that's all I have to say.
For this reason, it would be concluded that the attack was a planned act of terrorism, perpetrated against anyone associated with the British military. As armed police were dispatched, people on the street filmed the two attackers pacing the area. They spoke openly about what they'd just done and seemed elated by their actions. All the while, Lee Rigby lay deceased on the road. His head was covered by some cloth to hide the blood and damage. He had suffered horrific injuries, with the attackers returning every now and then to further stab his body. They had even tried to behead him. Police response wasn't that fast considering the serious nature of the crime, and they arrived after roughly 15 minutes. Many passers-by had no idea what had just happened and some believed it to have been an accidental car crash. In video footage, you can see random people walking by Michael Adebolojo, oblivious to the literal murderer right beside them. The lack of awareness shown by some members of the general public was insane. The attacker's car had hit into Lee Rigby before crashing into a pole. Both attackers didn't bother trying to flee the scene and had a plan for when the police arrived. Armed police arrived on scene and drew on the attackers, who didn't follow commands. Police fired at them and dropped them to the ground. It would be apparent that they had both tried to die from suicide by cop. They were already proud of what they'd just done, but this would have made them martyr symbols for their twisted cause. They didn't get that satisfaction. Following the attack, the attackers were left in hospital but soon recovered and were interviewed about the murder of Lee Rigby. They had been driving around the barracks, searching for a soldier to run over. Lee had been spotted, wearing a distinct army issue bag and the timings aligned. You can see the car swerve to hit Lee Rigby and the rest is history. Eyewitness testimony, CCTV and cell phone footage showed the entire murder and the aftermath. It was seemingly brutal and senseless to the public, but the perpetrators saw it very differently. Both men saw themselves as soldiers of Allah. They had been involved in gangs in their teenage years but had originally come from regular families, growing up in different parts of London. It could be said that it was the culture, peer group or the environment that they grew up surrounded by or some other factor, but the exact reason as to why the two men took this path in life isn't entirely clear. Radicalization played a role in the pair taking on extremist beliefs and listening to extremist preachers, which probably didn't help much for their sanity. Both men had been raised Christian but converted from Christianity to Islam. Michael Adebolojo was the most dominant of the pair and he was 29 years old. A surprising fact is that he was described as articulate and polite. Not long prior to the attack, he'd even returned to a petrol station to pay for fuel, when it turned out that he didn't have enough money on him. This is atypical for an offender who suddenly runs someone over and hacks them to pieces not long later. Another surprising fact is that Adebolojo had 6 children, with his most recent child having only been born 4 days prior to the attack. Clearly, his violent cause was more important than raising his children. Michael Adebowale was the other attacker and he was 22 years old. He had grown up in a middle-class family but somewhere along the line, something went wrong. He grew susceptible to radicalization and eventually adopted the most extreme perspective of Islam like his friend Adebolojo. As mentioned, Adebolojo saw himself as a soldier of Allah, fighting for a righteous cause. In 2010, he traveled over to Kenya. Kenyan authorities arrested him trying to participate in an active conflict in the country. British authorities had him on their radar and had tried to convince him to inform on members of a radical group that he was involved in. Adebolojo refused. In early 2014, both Adebolaho and Adebowale were found guilty of Rigby's murder. The most vocal suspect, Adebolaho, was sentenced to a whole life tariff in prison, meaning he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Adebowale was given a minimum term of 45 years. Having received the sentence, they were told by the judge that their actions were a betrayal of Islam. They didn't respond well to this and freaked out in the courtroom. The pair were transported to prison. Whilst inside, guards weren't feeling one of Lee Rigby's murderers. Adebolaho was rammed head first into the cell wall. He lost some teeth in the incident. Behind bars, it has been said that Adebolaho sticks by his cause. He has tried to recruit other inmates into radicalization. Since the UK prison system is majority Muslim and prison is a place where violence is respected, I'm sure that he is finding success in this venture. Lee Rigby's family have had to suffer with his absence. Lee was a father, a husband and a good man. He was only 25 years old when he was murdered by two misguided men with evil in their hearts. His murder will always be a reminder that even at home, you're not safe from an attack such as this. It was planned out and carried out effectively, with there being little in place to have prevented it. Years later, similar attacks would be launched against the British public in the capital. Each attack proved fateful and similar loss was the result. Rest in peace, Lee Rigby.